Begin with the internationally disturbing war between Russia and Ukraine. The European Union says it will deal with the organizers of the just concluded referendums in Ukraine. The Union maintains the widely criticized referendums are a sham held under Russian dictatorship. The Russian President Vladimir Putin is expected to declare the annexation of the 4 territories where they were held this week. We'll have more details in this report.
As the referendums in Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine receive more international criticisms, the United Nations Under-Secretary-General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Rosemary Ann DiCarlo, has told the Security Council that the referendums were held during active armed conflict and outside Ukraine's legal and constitutional framework. She says they cannot be called a genuine expression of the popular will of the people.
These exercises, which began on 23 September, have been held during active armed conflict in areas under Russian control and outside Ukraine's legal and constitutional framework. They cannot be called a genuine expression of the popular will. Unilateral actions aim to provide a veneer of legitimacy to the attempted acquisition by force by one state of another state's territory, while claiming to represent the will of the people, cannot be regarded as legal under international law.
Briefing via video teleconference, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the annexation of the captured territories is the most brutal violation of the UN Charter. He said another attempt to annex Ukrainian territory will mean that there is nothing to talk about with the Russian president, because the annexation is a move that puts him alone against the whole of humanity. President Zelensky maintains Ukrainians in the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donbas region, and the currently occupied areas of the Kharkiv region and the Crimea will be freed.
The annexation of the captured territories. This is the most brutal violation of the UN Charter. This is an attempt to steal the territory of another state. This is an attempt to erase the norms of international law. This is a very cynical attempt to force the male population in the occupied territory of Ukraine to mobilize into the Russian army in order to send them to fight against their own homeland.
On his part, Russian Ambassador Vasily Nebentia says the referendums are long-awaited events for the inhabitants of Donbas, who for a long time have sought to bring peace to their land, which they haven't experienced for 8 years. The EU says there will be consequences for the organizers of so-called referendums in occupied parts of Ukraine. Pro-Russia leaders in the 4 occupied regions say the votes show the vast majority of people supports the annexation of the areas by Russia. Referendums held for 5 days have just been concluded in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia region of Ukraine for residents to vote on whether or not they wish to become part of the Russian Federation.
And joining me virtually now from Washington, D.C. to discuss the controversial referendums and the EU's resolve to sanction Russia, amongst other matters arising in the war, is a global affairs analyst, Calvin Dark. Good to have you join us.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's begin from this backlash we're seeing concerning the call-up of military reservists in Russia and the conscription of young men into the military. We've seen backlash in Crimea as well, activists saying that men are literally being pulled from their homes. And then we're seeing young men also at the border, border between Russia and Georgia. How do you think that this is playing out for this announcement? It is playing out for Putin back home, and why do you think he has not done anything to at least walk it back?
Well, I think that, throughout these last 7 months, we've all wondered, what the Russian people were thinking, because most of the information they were getting wasn't accurate, right? But with the conscription of these reservists, as Putin has called it, this really hits home, quite literally, with Russians. And we've seen the protests. So I think in that sense, this is probably the biggest indicator of how Russian people feel for this special military operation, as Putin has called it. Now, when it comes to how this will change Putin's calculation, It depends. If we were dealing with a rational actor who wanted to not inflict economic and other pains on his country and pay attention to world order and international law, that would be different. But we're talking about someone who obviously flaunts that. So this looks to me like a sign of desperation on his part.
And I will get to that desperation in just a moment. But you mentioned the reports we've been getting from Russia. Do you think that this particular announcement is undoing, or that a lot of people have been dissatisfied with the war, and perhaps this is the first time because of they are now going to be involved in the war, and so for the first time we're hearing that dissent in terms of Putin's action in Ukraine?
I think that this, calling up of soldiers and all the actions recently of Putin signaled to me a point of no return, meaning that he's all in for his strategy. Now, the thing is up until now, like I said, there hadn't been as many protests or, expressions of dissent from the Russian people, but now there are. And so I don't see Putin walking it back. I see him either continuing it or ending it, because it's got to the point now where people are feeling it in their lives in ways that they weren't before. So he can't propaganda his way out of this.
And let me just paint the picture, and then you sort of you state if you agree with me or not. It almost seems as though what we're seeing is someone who has lost the war strategically, as it were, but is refusing to accept loss of the war, and so would do anything at the point. So what we're seeing now, most of the actions we're seeing now, is Putin refusing to accept that he has lost the war.
Well, here's what I think. I think that the events of late definitely point to challenges, and that he is losing in ways that I don't think he even predicted. But I don't necessarily think this is a loss yet for him, because, of course, there was the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, which they haven't exactly said who did it, but I think most of the people in the world can figure out who that was. I think that was strategic because it showed the vulnerability of Europe's energy infrastructure. Also, even when you combine the conscription of the reservists with the referendums, it shows desperation, but it also shows that Putin is not anywhere close to bringing this to a negotiated, peaceful end. And so I think that's what we need to take care of. That's what we need to consider, that, yeah, he may be losing, but I don't see any indication of him giving up.
And do you think, because you've mentioned that we're seeing desperation, do you think that desperation will lead to the use of nuclear weapons, as we've heard from Kremlin spokesperson in the past few days?
I hope not. I do think, though, that, and we heard this from U.S. officials and European officials, that not saying that they think it's likely, but that it's not a bluff. And that's why I think the international community is probably going to double down for two reasons. One, the nuclear threat, and two, the coming of winter. I think it's a real threat, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
And let's talk about the annexation of some territories in Ukraine, and how EU is now responding. EU is threatening to respond with sanctions. But at this point, and I'm sure you've listened to the Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, where he said that, look, there is a backlash to these sanctions. Do you think that even more sanctions would work at this point?
Well, first, when it comes to sanctions, and this, being from the European powers or from the U.S., there's only so much sanctions that you can put on. I was seeing today that there's some more stringent banking restrictions that would cripple Russia's economy, but sanctions can only go so far. We also have to remember too that when it came to the referendums that we've been saying that obviously aren't accepted by anybody except for Putin and those who support him, Putin is not looking for international legitimacy for his actions. He's looking for legitimacy amongst his supporters to then take greater actions in this war in Ukraine. So we have to remember, we're not dealing with somebody who at all feels the pressure of not meeting some international law standard, because that's not his focus.
And do you think that at this point he would find that legitimacy with Russians? Again, the supporters should be Russians, and I'm guessing that's what you mean. And do you think that at this point he would find that legitimacy? I listened to an analyst who said perhaps this could be the end of the, in quote, reign of Putin in Russia.
Well, I do think from Putin's point of view, he looks at these sham referendums as legitimate. But now when it comes to his position of power, there's only so much failure and losing that the Russian people and even those who support him in Russia are going to tolerate. So while Putin may consider this legitimate because now he can claim, if he accepts their offer to become part of Russia, he can claim that these are attacks on Russian territory. That's fine for his strategy. But when the Russian people continue to see these losses, and when they continue to see people pulled off the streets, pulled out of their houses to fight in this conflict, that threatens his legitimacy inside Russia, which, he's a strong man, but he has his weaknesses as well. And I think we'll see him fall to those if the losses continue to amass.
Let me get your thoughts on a comment made by former CIA Director General Petraeus. He said that in rebuilding Ukraine, there has to be security guarantees, and perhaps that we would see in anytime soon invitation by NATO for Ukraine to join the alliance, and perhaps that the time is now, and it is going to happen sooner or later. Do you agree that this has further pushed Ukraine towards NATO, and that invitation, we're going to see that invitation from NATO to Ukraine?
I don't know if we're going to see that invitation anytime soon. I do agree with Petraeus that however this is resolved, hopefully sooner rather than later, I think it will involve security protections, maybe inclusion in NATO. But, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. That was Russia and Putin's main argument for starting this war, was the encroachment of NATO to Russian territory. And when we look at the countries that have joined since then, this possible partnership, even joining Ukraine into NATO, it's the exact opposite of what Putin said he was fighting against in the beginning, which I think is another indication of how this is not going how he or any of his supporters in Russia planned.
Global Affairs analyst Calvin Dack, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.